It's a sweltering July morning in 1930, and in a modest farmhouse kitchen in rural Iowa, a farm wife named Clara Hensley wipes the sweat from her brow as she churns butter by hand. Outside, the sun beats down on endless fields of corn, and inside, the air is thick with the heat of a wood stove that's been burning since dawn. While city folks in Des Moines or Chicago might flip a switch for an electric fan or open a humming refrigerator to grab a cold drink, Clara and millions like her across the American countryside are locked in a daily struggle against spoilage and time. There's no electricity on this farm, no ice delivery down the dirt road that stretches 5 miles to the nearest town, and no modern appliance to keep milk from souring by midday. Yet, in this unassuming kitchen, Clara is quietly mastering a craft born of necessity, turning the earth itself into a lifeline for her family's food. This is the documented story of how American farm wives, with no refrigerators in sight, transformed wells, cellars, and sheer ingenuity into makeshift ice boxes that kept their households fed. Before the 1930s, the American farm was a world apart from the electrified bustle of urban centers. While over 80% of city homes in states like New York and Illinois had access to power by the end of the 1920s, fewer than 15% of rural farms nationwide were wired, and in swaths of the Midwest and Deep South, that number often dropped to near zero. Without electricity, there were no electric lights to brighten a barn at night, no pumps to draw water effortlessly from the ground, and most critically for daily survival, no electric refrigerators to preserve perishable goods. During the harsh years of the Great Depression, compounded by the Dust Bowl's devastation in states like Oklahoma and Kansas, farm families couldn't afford the luxury of commercial ice delivery, which was sporadic at best for those living at the end of remote county roads. Instead, they relied on methods passed down through generations, adapting to a life where keeping meat, milk, and leftovers from spoiling shaped every meal and every chore. Clara Hensley, like so many others, was born into this reality on a 120-acre plot near the small town of Winterset, Iowa, in 1898. She grew up as the eldest of 6 children in a family that scratched out a living raising hogs and growing corn, learning early how to stretch every resource. Her father, a Civil War veteran turned farmer, taught her to read the land as much as any book, pointing out the coolest spots under the house where the air stayed damp even in August. Clara's hands were calloused from years of hauling water buckets and preserving harvests, and after marrying a local farmer in 1919, she took on the unrelenting task of feeding a growing family with no modern tools to ease the burden. With no bank loans or fancy equipment, she worked in a kitchen that doubled as her laboratory, using nothing but what the farm provided: scrap wood, rope, and the natural geography of the land, to solve problems that city engineers hadn't yet considered for rural life. The challenge facing Clara and countless farm wives wasn't just a lack of refrigeration, it was a fundamental barrier that even the biggest corporations and government programs of the era hadn't fully tackled. Companies like General Electric and Frigidaire were producing electric refrigerators by the late 1920s, but these machines required a reliable power grid that simply didn't exist beyond city limits. Even in areas where ice delivery was an option, the cost, often 50 cents for a 25-pound block in 1930, equivalent to several dollars today, was prohibitive for families already bartering eggs for basic goods at the local store on Main Street. The problem was compounded by the climate, especially in southern states like Georgia and Texas, where summer temperatures regularly topped 90 degrees Fahrenheit, turning a gallon of milk into a curdled mess within hours if left on a countertop. Food preservation wasn't a convenience. It was a race against nature that demanded constant vigilance. Yet, in the face of these odds, Clara and her peers found a way forward with a brilliance that didn't need a patent or a factory. Their breakthrough lay in harnessing the Earth's own properties, turning hand-dug wells and root cellars into natural cooling systems. A typical farm well, often 20 to 30 feet deep, maintained a steady temperature of around 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, far cooler than the summer heat above ground. Clara would lower metal cans of milk and cream on a sturdy rope into the deepest part of her family's well, securing the line to a wooden beam so the containers hovered just above the water line where the air was coldest. Root cellars, dug into hillsides or beneath the farmhouse, offered another refuge with thick dirt walls and stone floors that kept temperatures stable, even when the kitchen upstairs sweltered. Here, she arranged jars of preserved vegetables and pans of leftovers on high shelves, ensuring air could circulate and reduce moisture buildup. In winter, her husband would cut blocks of ice from a nearby frozen pond, storing them in a small, half-buried ice house insulated with sawdust to last into spring. This wasn't just survival. It was a system, a cold chain crafted from dirt and determination, where every farm wife became an engineer of necessity. This quiet innovation stood in stark contrast to the industrial might of the era, where urban factories churned out solutions for those who could pay. While corporations focused on electrifying cities and selling appliances to suburban homes, rural America was left to fend for itself, often invisible to the policymakers in Washington, D.C. Clara didn't have a lab or a team of scientists. Her workshop was the damp corner of a cellar and the creaking pulley over a well shaft. Her story, and that of millions of farm wives across states like Missouri, Nebraska, and Alabama, reveals a resilience that didn't wait for progress to arrive on its doorstep. They built their own, one cool jar of milk at a time, proving that necessity could turn a farmhouse into a fortress against spoilage, long before power lines reached the end of the lane. In the early 1930s, as Clara Hensley and countless farm wives across the American heartland fought their daily battle against spoilage, the resistance to their way of life wasn't just from nature's heat or the absence of electricity. It came from a broader system that overlooked their ingenuity. While urban centers buzzed with innovation and New Deal programs began to promise rural electrification, the immediate needs of isolated farm families remained a low priority for those in power. State governments and utility companies hesitated to extend power lines into sparsely populated areas, citing high costs and low returns. In Iowa alone, over 90% of farms were still off the grid by 1932, despite growing pressure for reform. Private ice delivery services, often run by regional businesses out of towns like Cedar Rapids, charged steep prices that could eat up a week's worth of egg money, sometimes as much as 75 cents for a single 50-pound block during peak summer demand. For a family like Clara's, scraping by on bartered goods and seasonal harvests, such expenses were unthinkable, leaving them to rely on their makeshift methods while the world beyond the county line moved forward without them. This neglect wasn't just economic, it was cultural, embedded in how rural life was perceived by those who shaped policy and industry. Newspaper editorials in city dailies like the Chicago Tribune often portrayed farm families as relics of a bygone era, too stubborn or backward to adopt modern conveniences, ignoring the reality that most couldn't afford them, even if they wanted to. In 1931, a federal report from the Department of Agriculture acknowledged the dire state of food preservation in rural areas, but offered little in the way of immediate solutions, focusing instead on long-term electrification goals that wouldn't reach places like Winterset for years. Meanwhile, appliance manufacturers tailored their marketing to urban and suburban households, with advertisements in magazines like Ladies' Home Journal showcasing gleaming electric refrigerators as symbols of progress, models like the 1930 Kelvinator, priced at over $200, were as out of reach for Clara as a luxury car. The message was clear. The future belonged to those already plugged in, not to the women lowering cans into wells under the Iowa sun. Even local institutions sometimes stood in the way of rural adaptation, often unintentionally reinforcing the divide. County agricultural extension agents tasked with educating farmers on new techniques were often underfunded and overstretched, visiting remote farms only sporadically. In Madison County, where Clara lived, a single agent covered over 200 families in 1930, with limited resources to teach anything beyond basic crop rotation or livestock care. Community efforts to pool resources for shared ice houses or cooperative buying of ice blocks frequently ran into roadblocks, as small-town banks, reeling from the Depression, denied loans for such modest projects. At a town hall meeting in Winterset in the summer of 1932, a proposal to fund a communal ice storage shed near the church basement was voted down by merchants who feared it would cut into their own sales of ice and preserved goods at the Main Street store. The pushback wasn't always malicious, but it was persistent. A quiet dismissal of the urgency farm wives faced every time a jug of milk began to turn in the July heat. Beyond these local and systemic barriers, there was a subtler form of resistance in the way rural ingenuity was undervalued by those who chronicled progress. Engineers and inventors in city labs, often backed by corporate giants like Westinghouse, were celebrated for breakthroughs in refrigeration technology, while the practical, hands-on solutions of farm women went unrecorded in the annals of innovation. In 1933, a trade journal out of St. Louis praised a new commercial ice-making plant as a marvel of modern engineering, without a mention of the thousands of rural households across Missouri and beyond who had been preserving food for decades using nothing but the Earth's natural chill. Clara and her neighbors weren't seeking recognition. They were too busy surviving. But their exclusion from the narrative of American advancement meant their contributions were buried, much like the cellars they relied on. A farmwife's knowledge of how to position a crock in the coolest corner of a dugout, or how to insulate an ice house with straw, wasn't seen as science. It was just what folks did, dismissed as folklore rather than expertise. This clash between rural reality and institutional priorities wasn't just a matter of oversight. It was a reflection of who held power to define progress. While federal committees in Washington debated the merits of rural electrification in boardrooms, and utility executives mapped out profitable grids that stopped at town limits, farm wives like Clara faced immediate consequences. Spoiled cream meant no butter to trade, and rancid meat meant a hungry family. The resistance they encountered wasn't marked by dramatic confrontations or public denouncements. It was a slow, grinding indifference, felt in every unreturned letter to a county official requesting help, every unaffordable price tag on a city appliance, and every policy that prioritized urban needs over dirt road struggles. Yet, in the face of this silence from above, these women didn't wait for permission or infrastructure to catch up. Their persistence in turning wells and cellars into lifelines was a quiet defiance, a refusal to let neglect dictate their survival, proving that innovation didn't always start in a factory or a funded lab. It started in the damp, shadowed spaces of a farmhouse where necessity carved out solutions the system hadn't yet imagined. As Clara Hensley lowered a metal can of fresh milk into the depths of her family's well on that Iowa farm, in the early 1930s, she wasn't just preserving food. She was defying a world that seemed determined to leave her kind behind. The resistance to rural farm wives like Clara didn't come with loud proclamations or dramatic showdowns. It was woven into the very fabric of a society racing toward modernity, while ignoring the dirt roads that fed it. Beyond the natural challenges of heat and time, the real opposition came from institutions and systems that either couldn't or wouldn't address the immediate needs of families living miles from the nearest power line. In 1932, while Clara's hands were busy tying ropes and arranging jars in a root cellar near Winterset, the state of Iowa reported that over 90% of its farms still lacked electricity, a statistic mirrored across much of the Midwest, as utility companies balked at the expense of extending lines to scattered homesteads. The economic barriers were as formidable as any summer heat wave. Ice delivery, a lifeline for some rural families closer to town, was a luxury Clara's family couldn't afford, with prices in Madison County often reaching 60 cents for a 25-pound block during peak demand, an amount that could buy a week's worth of flour at the local store. For a household bartering hogs and eggs to make ends meet, such costs were out of reach, especially during the lean years of the Great Depression when every penny was accounted for. Meanwhile, appliance manufacturers in cities like Detroit and Pittsburgh churned out electric refrigerators with price tags starting at $150 for the most basic models in 1931, a sum equivalent to months of farm income for many. These companies rarely considered rural markets in their plans, focusing instead on urban customers already connected to the grid, leaving women like Clara to make do with solutions that didn't require a monthly bill or a salesman's pitch. Local and state-level indifference added another layer of struggle. In Iowa, county agricultural extension services meant to bridge the gap between rural families and new advancements, were often staffed by a single agent covering hundreds of farms with limited time and funding. In 1930, the agent assigned to Madison County visited Clara's area only twice a year, offering advice on crop yields, but little practical help for food preservation beyond vague pamphlets. Efforts to organize community solutions, like shared ice storage near the Winterset Church, were frequently stifled by small-town politics. In late 1931, a proposal for a cooperative ice house was rejected by local merchants who saw it as competition to their own goods sold on Main Street, prioritizing profit over communal need. Even when farm wives wrote letters to state representatives pleading for assistance or infrastructure, responses were slow or non-existent, buried under stacks of paperwork in Des Moines offices, more concerned with urban recovery projects. Cultural dismissal from the broader American narrative deepened this isolation. In the early 1930s, articles in major newspapers like the Des Moines Register often framed rural life as quaint or outdated, with editorials suggesting that farm families simply needed to catch up to city standards, ignoring the structural reasons why they couldn't. A 1932 piece in a national magazine praised the sleek design of a new Frigidaire model as the future of American kitchens, without a single mention of the millions of households still relying on wells and cellars for the same purpose. This wasn't just oversight. It was a quiet erasure of rural ingenuity, as if the daily calculations of a farm wife, knowing exactly how deep to lower a jug for maximum coolness or how to ventilate a cellar to prevent mold, didn't qualify as innovation. The federal government, too, contributed to this narrative gap. A 1933 report from the U.S. Department of Agriculture noted the backward state of rural food storage, but allocated no immediate resources, instead funneling funds into long-term electrification plans that wouldn't reach Clara's farm until nearly the end of the decade. The power imbalance between isolated farmsteads and the decision-makers shaping America's future was starkly evident in specific policies and actions. Utility giants like Iowa Power and Light, headquartered in urban centers, repeatedly delayed rural grid expansion, citing in their 1932 annual report that connecting just 1,000 additional farms would cost over $500,000 with little guaranteed return, a business decision that left families like Clara's in the literal dark. At the same time, federal committees in Washington, D.C., held hearings on rural electrification that rarely included voices from the actual countryside, relying instead on testimony from industry leaders who had never stepped foot in a root cellar. This disconnect wasn't marked by hostility, but by a pervasive apathy, felt in every unanswered request for aid and every advertisement for modern appliances that might as well have been written for a different country. Yet, despite being sidelined by economics, policy, and perception, farm wives like Clara didn't falter. Their resistance to spoilage was matched by a deeper resilience against a system that undervalued their role in keeping America fed. Every jar carefully placed in the coolest corner of a hillside dugout, every block of pond ice hoarded through spring in a sawdust-packed shed, was a small act of defiance against being forgotten. They weren't waiting for power lines to snake across the county or for a delivery truck to rumble down their lane. They were solving problems in real time, with hands that knew the land better than any engineer's blueprint. Their story wasn't splashed across headlines or debated in boardrooms, but it was etched into the damp stone walls of cellars and the worn ropes dangling into wells, a testament to a kind of progress that didn't need permission or applause to keep a family alive one more day. As Clara Hensley tied a sturdy rope around a metal can of fresh cream on her Iowa farm in the summer of 1932, she was not only battling the relentless heat, but also standing against a system that seemed to have little room for her world. The resistance to the way of life she and countless other farm wives endured didn't come with fanfare or fiery speeches. It was a quieter, more insidious force, rooted in the priorities of a nation sprinting toward urban modernity. Beyond the daily grind of preserving food without electricity, the real opposition stemmed from institutions and industries that either overlooked or undervalued the struggles of rural America. In Madison County, where Clara's farmhouse stood, over 85% of farms remained unconnected to any power grid by 1933. a direct result of decisions made far from the dirt roads that defined her life. Economic hurdles formed a wall as unyielding as the August sun. Commercial ice delivery, a lifeline for some families nearer to town centers, was often priced out of reach for isolated farms like Clara's. In 1932, a 30-pound block of ice could cost as much as 65 cents during peak summer months in Winterset, a sum that might represent half a week's worth of bartered goods at the local diner. For a family already stretching every resource during the depths of the Great Depression, such an expense was a bitter impossibility. Meanwhile, the burgeoning appliance industry in cities like Cleveland and Chicago was rolling out electric refrigerators, models like the 1932 General Electric Monitor Top, retailing for around $180, priced for urban households with steady incomes and reliable power, not for a farm wife whose annual cash flow might not even reach that figure. At the state and local levels, the neglect was just as palpable, often wrapped in bureaucratic inertia. In Iowa, county extension services, meant to support rural families with practical knowledge, were woefully understaffed. By 1931, a single agent in Madison County was responsible for over 180 farms, with visits so infrequent that Clara might see them only once a season, often with no new solutions for food storage beyond worn-out leaflets. Grassroots attempts to ease the burden, such as a 1932 community plan to build a shared ice storage shed near the VFW Hall in Winterset, were thwarted by local business owners who argued it would undercut their sales of ice and canned goods on Main Street, a decision made at a packed town meeting where farm wives' voices were drowned out by merchants' concerns. Letters sent to state legislators in Des Moines pleading for infrastructure support often went unanswered, lost in a sea of urban-focused recovery initiatives following the stock market crash. Culturally, the dismissal of rural life by those documenting America's progress added another layer of isolation. Editorials in newspapers like the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in 1933 often painted farm families as stubbornly clinging to outdated ways, failing to acknowledge the structural barriers that kept electricity and modern conveniences at bay. Trade publications celebrated urban refrigeration advancements, with a 1932 article hailing a new commercial cooling plant in Kansas City as a triumph of engineering, while offering no mention of the thousands of rural women across Missouri who had mastered food preservation using nothing but the natural chill of their land. Even federal acknowledgement fell short. A 1931 U.S. Department of Agriculture bulletin highlighted the urgent need for rural food storage solutions, but diverted its recommendations to future electrification projects, offering no interim aid to women like Clara, who couldn't wait years for power lines to reach their front porches. The disparity between rural necessity and institutional focus was underscored by specific actions, or the lack thereof, from those in power. Utility companies like Central Iowa Power and Light, based in larger towns, reported in their 1932 financial statements that extending service to just 500 additional farms would cost upwards of $300,000, a figure they deemed unfeasible given the sparse population and uncertain profits, effectively writing off entire counties. In Washington, D.C., congressional discussions on rural electrification throughout 1933 relied heavily on input from industry executives rather than testimonies from actual farm families, ensuring that policies remained detached from the reality of a root cellar's damp air. This wasn't overt hostility, but a pervasive disregard, felt in every delayed response from a county clerk and every appliance catalog mailed to city addresses, while farmhouses were left off the list. Yet against this backdrop of systemic indifference, Clara and her peers across the American countryside stood resolute. Their resistance to spoilage mirrored a deeper defiance of a world that seemed content to let them fade into obscurity. Each jar of vegetables carefully positioned in the coolest nook of a hillside dugout, each block of winter ice painstakingly stored in a barn shed with layers of straw, was a silent rebuttal to being overlooked. They weren't holding out for a truck to rumble down their lane with a block of ice or for a power pole to appear on the horizon. They were crafting survival day by day, with hands that understood the Earth's rhythms better than any corporate blueprint. Their ingenuity didn't make the front page of city papers or earn a nod in government reports, but it was carved into the worn wooden beams above a well and the cool stone shelves beneath a kitchen, a living proof that progress didn't always start with a factory whistle. It often began in the quiet, shadowed corners of a farm, where necessity turned hardship into a solution that kept a family fed for one more day. By the mid-1930s, the quiet ingenuity of farm wives like Clara Hensley began to intersect with a broader wave of change sweeping across rural America, marking a turning point in their long battle against spoilage. While wells and cellars had sustained families through years of isolation, the arrival of the New Deal's Rural Electrification Administration in 1935 started to reshape the landscape, quite literally stringing hope across the countryside. In Iowa, where Clara's farm sat on the outskirts of Winterset, the first power lines began to appear along county roads by 1937, bringing with them the promise of electric refrigerators that could replace the rope and can systems of the past. By 1939, over 25% of farms in Madison County were connected to the grid, a staggering leap from the mere 10% just 7 years prior, allowing families to shift crocks of milk from damp cellars to humming Kelvinator units bought on installment plans tailored for rural budgets. This transformation wasn't just about technology, it was a lifeline that altered the rhythm of daily life on the farm. In states like Nebraska and Missouri, where electrification spread at a similar pace, farm wives who had once spent hours calculating the coolest shelf in a root cellar could now store larger quantities of meat and dairy without the constant fear of a warm day ruining their stores. By 1940, the U.S. Department of Agriculture reported that nearly 1.5 million rural homes nationwide had gained access to electricity, with many investing in refrigerators as their first major appliance, fundamentally changing how meals were planned and preserved. In small-town diners near Clara's farm, gossip over coffee began to include talk of recipes that relied on chilled ingredients, a luxury that had been unimaginable just a decade earlier when a pot of stew had to be rushed underground after supper. The impact reached beyond the kitchen, touching the very economy of rural communities. With reliable cold storage, farm families in areas like central Iowa could hold on to surplus butter and cream longer, selling them at better prices during market days in towns like Des Moines, rather than bartering at a loss to avoid spoilage. In 1938, records from the Winterset Farmers Co-op showed a 30% increase in dairy sales from electrified farms compared to those still off the grid, a direct result of being able to preserve goods for days instead of hours. This newfound stability meant children could carry cold lunches to the one-room schoolhouse without worry, and church potlucks on Sundays featured dishes kept fresh overnight, weaving modern convenience into the fabric of community traditions. On a national scale, the shift influenced agricultural policy and wartime readiness as the 1940s dawned. With rural refrigeration becoming more widespread, the federal government began to see farm households as critical to food security during World War II, with programs launched in 1942 to subsidize appliance purchases for those contributing to the war effort through surplus production. In states like Kansas, over 10,000 farm homes received discounted refrigerators under these initiatives by 1943, ensuring that meat and vegetables could be stockpiled for troops and civilian rationing programs alike. Clara's own farm, wired in late 1937, became part of this network, her kitchen now a small but vital node in a country mobilizing every resource, a far cry from the solitary struggle of lowering cans into a well just to make it through the week. The ripple effects extended to health and safety, often in ways that went uncelebrated but saved lives. Access to consistent cold storage by the end of the decade reduced foodborne illnesses in rural areas, where previously a single hot day could turn a jug of milk deadly. A 1941 health survey in Iowa noted a 20% drop in reported cases of spoilage-related sickness among newly electrified counties. For families like Clara's, this meant fewer sleepless nights worrying over a child's fever from bad cream, and more time to focus on the endless other demands of farm life. The cellar, once a makeshift lifeline, became a storage space for canned goods rather than a desperate refrigerator, its stone walls now a relic of a harder era. Yet, As this wave of progress rolled forward, the personal cost and brilliance of those early years risked fading into shadow. Clara Hensley, like so many farm wives across the Midwest, didn't make it into the glossy advertisements for Frigidaire models or the government reports touting electrification triumphs. Her name wasn't recorded in the ledgers of innovation, though her hands had engineered survival long before a power pole stood on her property. Today, when we twist open a cold bottle of milk from a supermarket cooler or stock a freezer with weeks' worth of groceries, there's an echo of Clara's quiet determination in every degree of chill, a reminder of the women who turned earth and water into a defense against time itself. We often celebrate the engineers who designed the first electric refrigerators or the politicians who signed the Rural Electrification Act into law, but we seldom pause to honor the farm wife who measured the depth of a well by feel, who knew the exact corner of a cellar where August couldn't reach. Every time you hear the hum of your refrigerator on a summer night, there's a piece of those forgotten innovators, women like Clara, still working in the background, their legacy as steady and cool as the ground they once relied on to keep their families whole.